was a learning curve, there's no doubt about it, but I'm really proud of the work that my team and I did to get this to not be alarmist, but also to identify a path where we could help mitigate the risk of a weapon of mass destruction being created through AI.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Kevin Frazier, an assistant professor at St. Thomas University College of Law and a Tarbell Fellow at Lawfare, with Department of Homeland Security Assistant Secretary Mary Ellen Callahan.
We have this whole of community effort where everyone is looking at this together. We can create, develop, and utilize guardrails to avoid reverse engineering or creation of novel pathogens.
Today we're talking about the DHS's report examining the possible misuses of AI leading to the production of chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats.
Back in October of 2023, the Biden administration issued an executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI. That lengthy executive order included a heck of a lot of provisions. One that may have flown under the radar was a directive that the Department of Homeland Security, quote, evaluate the potential for AI to be misused to enable the development or production of CBRN threats, while also considering the benefits and application of AI to counter those threats, end quote. The DHS recently finalized that report, and now Assistant Secretary Mary Ellen Callahan is here to break down its results. And I guess one thing we should start with is, what the heck does CBRN stand for?
CBRN, or CBRN, is chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear threats. In sum, it is what could be a weapon of mass destruction, or WMD.
Okay, so CBRN is not something to look forward to, especially in the context of AI. So let's start, though, with the process of developing this report itself. So it sounds like it was quite the collaborative effort. Can you tell us a little bit more about who put this report together?
Yes, the report was put together here in my office at the Department of Homeland Security's Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction office. We were instructed by DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas to prepare this report on his behalf. We did so because the CWMD office here at DHS is the subject matter expertise and the hub on CBRN threats. The way we put the report together is that we researched it a lot. We talked to a ton of think tanks, academia, folks that are experts in the field. We also talked to all of the major AI model developers, and we talked to the interagency about what their capabilities were, what their concerns were, and how to put these together. It really was a comprehensive and collaborative approach to think about how do we want to increase the promise of AI, particularly with regard to chemical and biological opportunities, while limiting the peril for chem or bio threats.
Now, I'm guessing you're probably not going to name names, and that's fine. But I'm curious to know, what was the engagement like from the AI labs themselves? Was this ongoing engagement, one-off conversations, or how involved were they actually?
They were very receptive to speaking to us about these issues. How to minimize CBRN threats and its availability in artificial intelligence and large language models is a relatively novel issue. I want to remind you, Kevin, that right before the executive order that you mentioned came out, all the major AI model developers had agreed to voluntary commitments that provided that they were going to agree to safety and security standards. And I know, having been on all of the calls with the model developers, they were struggling to figure out exactly what that meant, what their obligations would mean, and what their level of expertise would mean with regard to chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats, and how to minimize the access within their large language models.
Excellent. And so it seems like this was perhaps the first go for your office in terms of thinking about CBRN and AI specifically. Was there a bit of upskilling on your end in terms of your office getting that increased awareness of how AI might augment or impact these different threats?
This is certainly a novel and burgeoning area for the entire community. And the difference between what we knew this time last year and what we knew now about AI and the potential risks, I think everyone had a pretty steep learning curve. I've got a strong team within my policy shop that have been following this issue. I also have several subject matter experts, including, PhD biologists, chemists, and others to make sure we got the science correct. It was a learning curve, there's no doubt about it, but I'm really proud of the work that my team and I did to get this to not be alarmist, but also to identify a path where we could help mitigate the risk of a weapon of mass destruction being created through AI.
So certainly plenty of motivating factors to do good work when you think about an AI WMD. But knowing that there was a sort of time crunch to make sure you met the executive order's mandate, how did you all manage to get this report out in time? Was this a sort of all hands on deck approach, or has this methodically played out? And I guess a follow-up, a preemptory follow-up would be, is this going to be something that your office continues to keep an eye on, or now are you effectively just kind of passing the report on and hoping the president and Congress reacts however they see fit?
Yeah, the report itself was certainly a incredibly intense and labor intensive journey. With that said, we were able to leverage not only the expertise within my office, as I said, we're the centralized subject matter experts for CBRN threats, but also with the interagency and making sure that all of the departments and agencies' equities and authorities were considered when we wrote this report. People were very collaborative. As I mentioned, the large language model developers were very enthusiastic about speaking with us and were candid about what their anxieties were about safety and security concerns with CBRN threats. With that said, as I said, we've got a strong policy shop that has been handling issues adjacent to this and complementary to this for years. And so they were able to go and address it with the advice of our subject matter experts as well. With regard to what we're going to do next, there is an implementation plan or a phase in which we take the recommendations here, including that the US government provide guidance to large language model developers, that they provide areas to limit certain data that isn't already part of the public models. We're working on developing that in the interagency. There also is a public-facing aspect of this with the AI Safety Institute, which was created by the Department of Commerce. They'll probably have the public lead on implementing some of the guidance and recommendations that the interagency will be developing to help people make sure that they can comply with their voluntary commitments.
Excellent. And so before we dive too far into the weeds of the actual findings, just to focus on kind of the high level takeaway, should I go to sleep tonight, or should I be so deathly afraid of AI WMDs that you'd advise against any sort of rest for the foreseeable future?
I would recommend that you get some rest, Kevin, because I think it's important to make sure that we're all clear-eyed about what the current status is, but what also the potential for harm is. Obviously, right now, AI will lower barriers to entry for all actors, including malign actors. To answer your specific sleep question, right now, the physical creation of CBRN threats is still quite hard. There are choke points along the development way where it's hard to move from ideation to physical creation and then execution of a weapon of mass destruction. What we've tried to build into this report, and what we try to do when we work to counter weapons of mass destruction, is implement a pathway defeat model, thinking about ways where you can off-ramp bad actors or have them exit from the pipeline of developing a CBRN threat. And that's the hurdles that we've tried to put into this report, and to help the AI model developers put those off-ramps and exits in order to defeat the bad actor before they get to the execution. We obviously want to keep threats out of bad actors' hands, while also improving and making sure that the promise of AI will continue to blossom.
So there's no shortage of hurdles to realizing those goals. And I guess one of the first findings that I came across that I want to dive a little bit deeper into is that you all pointed out the need for more work to build consensus about the scope of AI risks. Obviously, we've heard from some folks who maybe self-identify or have been labeled as doomers, folks who think that AI may bring about catastrophic risks sooner rather than later, to other folks who have in some cases been deemed accelerationists who are championing AI as holding the future for a much better world. So how do you think we're going to be able to build consensus about AI risks? Obviously, as we're going to explore further here, you all have laid out a lot of the risks that could manifest, but just how important is it to focus first on getting everyone to agree that these risks actually are present?
I'm glad you noticed that we tried not to be alarmist in this report, but also tried to be clear-eyed to identify paths that we could take. This has to be a whole of community effort. Everyone must work in order to put this together. Obviously, the AI model developers promised to do so in the voluntary commitments from last summer. And we as the US government want to support them. But one of the things I wanted to flag for you is that the AI model developers need to take ownership of what the models themselves produce. And we want to give them tools to do that, but also enable them and provide a baseline on what those voluntary commitments mean. I want to draw your analogy, Kevin. I worked on developing a series of self-regulatory guidance in the early 2000s related to the internet and particularly ad serving and privacy policies. In that circumstance, it had a similar self-regulatory promise where that was self-executing. But in retrospect, what was missing was an overarching framework or identification of what a baseline compliance standard would look like. And what happened was all of the companies applied different standards, different tools, different processes. There was no consistency, and there was an opportunity for the lowest common denominator of safety and security to win out. What we want to do is ameliorate that, not allow the lowest common denominator of access to CBRN threats to be the winner in this circumstance, but instead to give everyone that baseline identification of how to identify novel chemical and biological threats, how to derail or off-ramp people before they go into the execution of it, to look for anomalistic behavior, and to make sure that everyone is trying to address the CBRN risks on a similar standard or at least a baseline framework.
And I think diving into this self-regulatory idea is really important right now because as we're talking, it's late June 2024. We know that there are regulatory efforts afoot in California. There are various proposals in DC, and the UK has already taken the lead in getting its UK AI Safety Institute up and running. The EU has passed the EU AI Act. And one of the concerns that's emerged with respect to this idea of self-regulation is maybe the labs haven't been quite as willing to hold themselves accountable to those voluntary standards as we'd hope. For example, there have been reports that the UK AC hasn't really received as much pre-deployment testing from the labs as they had hoped. So are you optimistic that this sort of report and the rapport you were building with the labs might increase the odds of them learning from this report, implementing its findings, and continuing to kind of raise the bar a little bit higher for themselves?
I am optimistic that a whole of community effort will be more effective in limiting the CBRN risks with regard to AI while also raising the standard overall. One of the things I noticed in my interviews with the large language model developers last fall is that they all were taking very different and very disparate approaches. That may be some of the things that you referenced the UK may be experiencing. I'm not sure, but everyone was looking at this in a different framework or a different way. That's why I think some US government guidance could be helpful on how to address it. And as I said, the AI Safety Institute created by the Department of Commerce could help really bolster that, push out the guidance. have better training, have better understandings of what the threat and risks are. That, of course, is one of our recommendations in here as well. So I am optimistic that we can get there. We can also leverage other existing federal laws and legal frameworks. Think about intellectual property, export control, technology transfers, foreign investments, obviously commercial transactions, data privacy, cybersecurity, and then leveraging our allies' international laws as well in order to have a comprehensive approach to it. I think there are real opportunities to leverage what we have right now. And if that's insufficient, then we can talk about regulations. As you know, Kevin, regulations tends to be a reactive scenario, and it tends to not be able to be nimble. And I think we need to be nimble here, which is why we're pinning some, but not all of this on the voluntary commitments to which the model developers first agreed.
So I think you're spot on with the idea that we don't need to reinvent the wheel, or as ChatGPT prompted me to respond, we don't need to remake the PB&J.
We do not need to make the PB&J. That is a great quote.
I turned to ChatGPT and AI for all help on avoiding tired phrases, and Lord knows I love a PB&J. So there's no AI exception, for example, to creating a chemical weapon. We know that it's illegal under domestic and international law, thankfully. But in some cases, we are indeed seeing novel tools that I do think raise some particularly tricky and bespoke legal issues. So one of these tools I want to focus on in particular is the idea of biological design tools. So I don't think most listeners will have heard of BDTs. Can you tell us a little bit more about the function of BDTs and why they were a focus for you all in this report?
Well, biological design tools are highly specialized tools that can create novel biological pathogens and novel biological compounds. The BDTs, as you referred to them, they could enable, for example, well-informed scientists to produce chemical or biological threats that could evade medical countermeasures. That's one of the things that we're concerned about, that they basically are bad actors while they can help avoid what we would have as a response to symptoms, right? Medical countermeasures, therapeutic or prophylactic treatments. The BDTs right now are very high end. They're very bespoke, and they're relatively inaccessible unless you have a high standard. You're part of a biological lab. You're kind of a known quantity. We want to further highlight the know your customer concept with regard to these really high-end bespoke biodesign tools to make sure that we know who's using the materials, that it can't be just part of a regular public large language model, but that we really have some governance around who's using it, what they're using it for, and how they're implementing it. BDTs could also create an inadvertent or an accidental disclosure of a bio threat, which is why having the standards, the trainings, the know your customer enhanced screening, but also candidly creating a culture of responsibility within those labs and within those communities. If people, DHS has a well-hewn slogan, if you see something, say something, first taken from the NYPD. But it really, I gotta give my props to where it first came from. But see something, say something is a really great way to think about physical security. We want to encourage people to use see something and say something about biological and chemical research security. If somebody's doing something that doesn't make sense, or you're seeing anomalistic behavior, to report that, to have maybe a safe harbor mechanism, some sort of vehicle where you can report bad actors and use that off-ramp or derailing on the pathway defeat models.
This is really interesting to hear because I think it taps into this larger idea we're seeing really emerge across the responsible AI community about a need for a right to warn about AI dangers. Obviously, traditionally, whistleblower laws protect folks who are reporting illegal activities. And so to broaden that to a right to warn and creating this culture of safety, I think is going to be one of the central challenges. And in particular, that may pertain to the federal government itself. You all mentioned that AI might help bolster the national biodefense security, which is interesting to think about, the dual use of AI, both threatening national security and perhaps bolstering it. How did you all think about those pros and cons? How one attribute of AI may at once be a risk while also increasing our national security?
I think that's the conundrum about biological and chemical research and leveraging AI. As I said, we really want to enhance the promise of AI, including finding bad actors, using it to find people who are violating the Biological and Toxic Weapon Convention or Chemical Weapons Convention. But at the same time, some of the developments and the creations can be used for good, to go and protect people, to respond to incidents, but also could be used as an offensive weapon. Of course, the United States does not do offensive bio or chemical research, but we do defensive research, and we have a compliance regime here at the Department of Homeland Security to work on that. But the AI is going to create novel pathogens, toxins, and others in ways that we can't yet predict, which is why we want to have this framework governance around it to make sure that we can get the goodness out of this dual use experiment or novel technology while we keep it out of the hands as much as possible of the bad actors. It is a tough balance. And I would say that biological research right now and the dual use research of concern is of heightened concern right now because of the potential scope.
There are so many instances and potential use cases we can dream up of AI solving cancer, curing the common cold, you name it. It's so much so that some people, when they think about AI risk, they turn to this idea of marginal risk, which is the idea that AI might have some risks, sure, but those risks need to be assessed relative to existing risks. So this concept has led some to believe that AI risks related to bioweapons are overblown. After all, there's nothing stopping you from going to Google and asking for a bit of information about how to create the next great, weird phrasing there, but the next best bioweapon. What's your response to those folks who say, you know what, this is just Google on steroids. Let's not blow this out of proportion. We should instead really be champions of accelerating AI use, especially in bio and medical instances?
Well, I think the dual use nature of these new biological incidents, experiments, is exactly the reason why we shouldn't just let 1,000 flowers bloom. This could be Google on steroids. It also could find novel combinations, right? AI is able to process data much more expeditiously and can find those anomalistic or mosaic aspects of data that a human would never be able to see, even if we were doing, machine learning type of testing. But I would, rather than talking about saying that, well, we should just let this happen, I want to return to my analogy of ad serving in the early 2000s. If we had kind of stronger governance or framework of what we knew was scoping appropriate and inappropriate, that would have helped create a more robust market in and of itself. I think we're at a watershed moment right now, Kevin. As I mentioned in the beginning, the physical creation of CBRN threats is still quite hard, and AI has not really lowered that barrier to entries right now. If we put in the controls and the governance right now, we can continue to have that pathway defeat off-ramp models to move bad actors away from all the way from ideation to execution of a weapon of mass destruction. But we have to put in the structure now before the physical creation of CBRN threats becomes easier.
With that idea of really having a concrete risk in mind, I think this has been one of the chief barriers to seeing more regulatory efforts be realized on the Hill. Representative Ted Lieu, for example, one of the more attentive House members to AI regulation and AI risks, has mentioned that he's not quite sure what specific threats we're supposed to regulate against. And I think this reflects a broader skepticism about doomerism. The sky's falling. When is it going to fall? Who's it going to fall on? I don't know. There's just so many big questions out there. But the report drills into some tangible threats that we should be concerned about. Can you talk a little bit more about those specific risks that you think regulators, labs, the public should be more aware of?
Well, I first wanted to draw your attention to recommendation 1A, which is to talk about incorporating AI-specific CBRN topics into intelligence and threat information sharing to make sure that we've got that reporting engagement among, in this it says, federal agencies, state and local stakeholders, allies, and partners, to make sure that they understand what the scope of those risks are and that we have ways to remove, reduce, or mitigate those threats and risks. Obviously, Congress would be part of that recommendation in order to make sure that they understand what the specific risks are. With regard to specific threats, I don't want to be alarmist again, but I would say that if you look at some of the areas we talked about, the bio design tools, we talked about some of the more bespoke biofoundries of creating things without even a lab itself. And I think it's important to make sure that, as I said, if we have this whole of community effort where everyone is looking at this together, we can create, develop, and utilize guardrails to avoid reverse engineering or creation of novel pathogens.
And with respect to the idea of addressing these risks, I think it's also important to note that we don't have to regulate AI in one fell swoop. In fact, I think it's pretty dang rare to ever see one omnibus bill for an entire general purpose technology. So going back to that idea that we don't have to remake that wonderful PB&J, you all note that there are known limitations in existing U.S. biological and chemical security regulations. That seems to me like some low-hanging fruit that doesn't necessarily have to draw concerns about folks who don't want to regulate AI or do want to regulate AI, but are kind of just easier to address because we already acknowledge that there could be some room for improvement. Can you talk a little bit more about how we could just bolster our chemical security regulations and enforcement generally?
Yes, because I work at the Department of Homeland Security, I'm going to lead with the U.S. Congress should reauthorize the CFATS, which is Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards. CFATS actually is a great partner for us, and it is one of the tools that we can use to go and leverage that. What we're recommending to do in the first instance, I mentioned we can leverage things like intellectual property, civil liability, export control, procurement, consumer protection, data privacy, and security as ways to think about this and how else we could bring civil, criminal, and other enforcement actions against folks. We have not yet done a comprehensive cross-sectoral analysis of all of the different options, but as you can hear by my rattling off several different vehicles, I think it's really important to say we've got these different lines, these different avenues, and to a certain extent, that diversity of options, civil, criminal, and other engagements really could benefit us because we could pull different levers on different types of chemical and biological threats. With that said, I will say that we may want to look at promulgating new rules under these existing authorities, thinking about maybe reframing some regulations. And then I think as a fallback position, to your earlier point about legislation, work with Congress if we find that there are gaps that address maybe unregulated or underregulated entities. But I think that that's a fallback position while we try to address these low-hanging fruit in the first instance.
When we talk about this engagement with Congress, what has been the reception so far to the report on the Hill? Have you seen any folks really embrace it, tout it, give you a call, send you a tweet? Has there been any meaningful engagement?
The report just came out on Monday, and we are scheduled to brief several of our authorizers and appropriators on the report, but I have not yet had a detailed engagement, but I know that they're busy. It's a complicated congressional environment right now, and we stand ready to support them and to talk about it. They have expressed significant and steady interest in our work on this report, but we have not yet engaged them since the report came out on Monday.
Well, and speaking to of consultation and collaboration. You all mentioned that there has been quite a degree of international collaboration on these issues and that there's a place for more collaboration on these issues. Can you talk about how you've worked with allies in this regard?
Yes, absolutely. I will speak generally about this because I don't want to disclose too much, but we were in consultation in the creation of this report with several close allies who are interested in this. They, of course, were very interested with the report coming out as well. And we are looking at ways to really to leverage their increased interest. And as I mentioned, we could have different types of regulations and guidance that are at least providing a framework in which to operate. I think this opportunity is ripe for cooperation, particularly with close allies, in order to provide that framework and role governance mechanism. And that it's crucial given the international nature of artificial intelligence.
On the opposite side of the equation, thinking about potential adversaries, not to play too much of a devil's advocate, but bringing up the idea of something like a Streisand effect, where by virtue of highlighting how these AI tools could be used for CBRN issues, is there any concern that this may just accelerate the fact that there seems to be a bit of an arms race with respect to AI going on between the US and China, for example, and perhaps some other adversaries?
We thought long and hard about the so-called Streisand effect when writing this report, which is why we don't go into too much detail and why this report is public. I think it's important to understand the points that I started this conversation with, which is that AI will lower barriers to entry for bad actors as well as good actors. And even though that the physical creation is hard right now, it's going to get easier. And we need to address this issue now. We tried, again, not to be alarmist about this, but to be practical about what our options are and how to ameliorate them and address them. I am not in the Department of State, so I'm not going to talk about diplomatic issues. I do think that the acknowledgement that there is both promise and peril in artificial intelligence probably is a universal tenet. And the question is, which is trying to be emphasized and which is trying to be limited. So I think it's important that the international community identify this as an area where collaboration and that whole of community effort needs to drive forward to make sure that we create a watershed moment so that we can respond differently to artificial intelligence and make sure we have the right structures in place.
Right. And one of those structures that seems really key, obviously this is pretty generally applicable, but it seems like you all really wanted to highlight this with respect to CBRN issues, was making sure that there was increased collaboration around attribution. Why is attribution such a tricky part of mitigating the use of AI to develop these sorts of threats?
I think it's really important to make sure that we are able to identify and to put attribution for suspected or bioagent chemical attacks, whether it be state actors or non-state actors, for a couple of different reasons. One, there are certainly treaty compliance issues related to arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. And those are really important to make sure that we have identified them. Two is to share the signatures that are related to the samples that we could develop, to make sure that they are shared in order to suppress or to mitigate them, and to share them in a safe and secure way, but also to go and find the root cause or the elements that could help attribute them to their origins. I think it's also an important aspect. We've been talking about novel bioagents and chemical agents. Novel threats are going to appear and are going to come forward, and we need to have an ability to create a forensic capability to look to find those unique signatures related to these novel biothreats. All of that has to be done together in an international environment and setting to make sure that we can mitigate this, address it, share with appropriate guidelines, and make sure that we can address this and get rid of the vulnerabilities as soon as possible.
Certainly, this will not be the last time the DHS or your office in particular is thinking about AI. We talked earlier about how there was some degree of upskilling that needed to go on when you were tasked with this report originally. What does the future look like for your office and DHS with respect to building up that talent force that's required to not only stay on top of this issue, but hopefully lead with respect to the mitigation of these threats?
Yeah, that's a great question. Here at DHS, we've really been leaning into artificial intelligence. We're very excited about the AI core. We have 10 people already in place, which is record time for the solicitation that we did, that the secretary did in the spring. There are real opportunities to leverage what is private sector skills in order to help bolster the U.S. capabilities, standards, and technologies. We are looking here at the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office to leverage some of those AI core and the other skills that we have. As I said, the department's really been leaning in on their use of their safe and secure, reasonable use of AI. So looking forward to working on it all together. And then I would say, I think the federal government overall needs to make sure that its standards and knowledge of artificial intelligence increase as we work to share the AI threats, but also the opportunities.
And I think you're spot on there. If you build it, they will come, right? I believe the AI core had something like 3,000 applicants,
Yeah.
and you hired 10 so far, and you're going to get to 50, I believe.
That is the Chief Artificial Intelligence Officer, Eric Hyson, will get to 50 soon. I know he and Mike Boyce have really been working on this, and we're really very excited of this, both for the knowledge, for the skill sets, but also for the precedent that it sets, that we can use, that we can be nimble in hiring when we need unique skills here in the federal government.
You do not always hear the words nimble and federal government used in the same sentence. So yes, that would be an impressive feat. And I guess just to take a step back even further, on a personal level, following this report, are you more or less fearful of AI's development?
I think I have a better understanding on where we are in the life cycle of artificial intelligence. And I really do think that this is a watershed moment where we must act. We must make sure that we get everyone on board to understand this model, this whole of community model can obviously be used not just for CBRN threats, but for security threats, for infrastructure threats, for the types of work that CISA and other parts of DHS are leveraging, obviously for CSAM that Homeland Security Investigations has been really working on. But to get everyone to understand how to work together on this, I think it is so crucial. And I'm really very excited about the opportunity that we could have everyone work together, having their own models, having their own processes, but understanding the baseline risks and how to address it, and getting guidance from the federal government while they go and use their implementation in their private sector models.
Given that we, of course, know that Washington is a place that is prone to title changes, not only in the swamp, but also in the administration, if there were to be a change in administration, has it so far felt as though this has been a bipartisan support for y'all's work?
I've mentioned about the enthusiasm, both from the private sector, academia, think tanks, the Hill, as well as the interagency. The vast majority of the work that was done on this report was done by career policy and subject matter experts. And as I said, I really feel so strongly that we're at this critical moment that I am confident that this type of work will continue, regardless of would you say title changes or administration changes. We have to do it. The time is now.
The time is now, and the time is now to say thank you for your time. I think we're going to leave it there.
Great. Thanks so much.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Pacha, and your audio engineer this episode was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thank you for listening.